In the austral spring of a year, most textbooks describe as uneventful. A white horizon at the edge of the world, briefly intersected with decisions made in rooms far from ice and wind. A vessel changed course, instruments were recalibrated, and official explanations settled too neatly into place. Why would a routine scientific journey drift so far from the richest waters it claimed to study? Why were maps consulted that ordinary researchers never see? Why did silence follow discoveries where celebration should have erupted? Why does the record show smooth continuity where eyewitness memory fractures? Why does Antarctica, of all places, keep inheriting unanswered questions from wars long declared over? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And, as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. The port was quiet, in a way that felt rehearsed rather than peaceful. In the autumn of 1972, the vessel known to the world as Calypso rested against the pier like an actor waiting for the curtain to rise, her reputation already fixed in the public imagination as a floating sanctuary for science and cinema. Cameras, diving gear, and crates labeled with harmless biological terms were loaded under the familiar banner of exploration. Official documents described nothing more dramatic than whale observation, underwater filming, and the continuation of a long-running documentary project that had already earned global admiration. On paper, it was routine. In reality, the routine ended before the ship ever left harbor. Jacques Cousteau was not present for much of the preparation. Instead of supervising the loading or briefing the crew, he traveled inland, first to Paris. There, away from the docks and the cameras, he spent days studying nautical charts that charted not the surface, but the hidden contours of the seabed, maps that traced underwater plateaus and trenches near Argentina and Antarctica. These were not the colorful educational charts familiar to students or amateur oceanographers. They were dense, technical, and restricted, the kind that required authorization because they revealed what lay beneath strategic waters. The absence of Cousteau at his own ship was noted by the crew, but no one challenged it. Legends, after all, were allowed their peculiarities. From Paris, he crossed the Atlantic, New York, then Los Angeles. The meetings there were not with marine biologists or environmental filmmakers, but with engineers, analysts, and men whose professions were described only in vague terms. André Laban, an engineer who would later become one of the few voices willing to speak, recalled that these encounters felt less like creative planning and more like closed briefings. There were no sketches of whales or discussions of lighting techniques underwater. Instead, coordinates were mentioned, timelines implied, and expectations set with an unspoken seriousness that did not belong to a nature documentary. When Cousteau finally returned to Calypso, the ship was nearly ready to sail. The crew noticed changes that were subtle but telling. Additional equipment had appeared, not flashy or exotic, but specialized. Reinforced diving gear, modified sonar arrays, communication systems with redundancies that exceeded the needs of filming marine life. None of this was explained. Official reports continued to emphasize whales, plankton, and the fragile balance of the Southern Ocean ecosystem. Yet the ship's route, plotted quietly in the navigation room, already contradicted those claims. Instead of steering toward the southeastern Antarctic waters known for dense krill blooms and massive whale populations, Calypso altered course. After heading south along the African coast, the ship veered west, cutting across the Atlantic toward Argentina. To seasoned sailors on board, the decision made little sense. If the goal was whales, biology dictated a different path. Feeding grounds are not mysteries. They follow currents and plankton, patterns taught in the first year of marine science. Yet Calypso ignored them, as if biology had become secondary to geometry, as if the destination was defined not by life, but by coordinates. The ship anchored in a remote Argentine bay, a place rarely mentioned outside specialized naval records. Beneath these waters lay 2 German submarines that had arrived there in 1945, at the very end of the Second World War. Their presence was one of those historical footnotes that provoked curiosity, but rarely investigation. Relics of a collapsing regime that had sent steel ghosts across the oceans. Calypso did not simply pass by. She stayed for weeks. Divers descended several times a day, returning with technical reports stripped of narrative. No excited chatter, no dramatic descriptions shared with the rest of the crew. The official transmission sent back to shore spoke calmly of whale behavior, water temperatures, and migration patterns, as if the dives were routine ecological surveys. But the frequency and precision of the operations betrayed another purpose. This was not casual observation. It was methodical, repeated, and focused. 3 years later, in 1975, Calypso returned to the same bay. By then, the German submarines were gone. Argentine naval forces had sealed off the area months earlier, deploying specialized lifting equipment in a tightly controlled operation that produced no press releases and no public explanations. The submarines vanished into classified storage or scrap yards unknown. And yet Calypso came back anyway, anchoring over an empty seabed and sending divers down once more. Whatever interested Cousteau here was not limited to steel hulls resting on sand. Around this time, another detail surfaced among the crew, too late to be ignored, but too late to challenge. Before sailing south in 1972, Cousteau had signed an agreement with the United States' Space Agency. On the surface, it was framed as scientific cooperation. In practice, it granted him access to satellite imagery of Antarctic regions of his choosing and obligated him to report any unusual findings directly to American authorities before informing his own government. A helicopter equipped for ice operations had been assigned, and real-time data links were established. This was not standard support for marine biology. It resembled the infrastructure of a search operation. When Calypso finally turned toward Antarctica in late November, the pattern continued. The ship headed not to vibrant biological zones, but to the northwestern sector of the continent, an area marine specialists on board privately described as unpromising. Sparse food chains, harsher conditions, fewer animals worth filming. Before 1945, this region had attracted military interest from distant powers. After the war, it fell under the control of a South American nation that guarded it carefully, imposing restrictions that had little to do with penguins or seals. Cousteau dismissed objections with a familiar argument: the value of studying the unknown. It sounded noble, even inspiring. But his insistence aligned too neatly with coordinates discussed months earlier in closed rooms thousands of miles away. The sense grew among some crew members that the expedition was following instructions written long before the cameras were switched on. The question hung unspoken in the cold air as Calypso cut through increasingly hostile waters. What exactly required this level of preparation, secrecy, and political coordination? The evidence suggested a target, not an ecosystem. A search that had begun decades earlier and had passed quietly from one generation to the next, adapting its cover stories to the language of the time. In 1939, it had been cartography and whaling. In 1946, it was military testing. In 1972, it was environmental filmmaking. The disguises changed, but the location remained stubbornly the same. By the fifth day along the Antarctic coast, instruments detected something that did not belong. Sonar readings revealed a massive metallic structure beneath the water, far larger than any known wreck recorded in that region. It was not a fishing vessel, not a standard submarine, not debris scattered by storms. The scale alone demanded attention. Cousteau ordered preparations for a dive with a calm that unsettled those who expected surprise. It was as if confirmation, not discovery, was taking place. What waited below would fracture the official narrative completely. But even before anyone entered the water, one thing was already clear to those paying attention. This expedition had never been about whales. It was about finding something history had misplaced, something hidden not only under ice and ocean, but under decades of silence. The descent was slow, deliberate, measured not by excitement but by procedure. Cold compressed itself into every movement as the divers followed the guideline downward, the light from the surface thinning into a pale suggestion rather than a source. Antarctica's waters do not welcome visitors. They preserve, they mute sound, they flatten color, and they distort scale. What appears distant can suddenly loom enormous, and what seems inert can feel disturbingly intentional. When the seabed finally came into view, the first impression was not of wreckage, but of absence. There was no scattered debris field, no chaotic trail of destruction. Instead, a single mass rested there, intact enough to feel placed, rather than lost. As the divers adjusted their orientation, the shape resolved itself into something unmistakable. A flat expanse stretched outward, unnaturally smooth, with edges too straight to be geological. The color was wrong. Not the dark corrosion of steel surrendered to salt, but a dull, faded white, like ice that had learned the geometry of industry. For a moment, scale refused to cooperate with expectation. The mind searched for comparisons that failed. This was not a cliff, not a shelf, not a natural formation. It was architecture. Moving closer dissolved the last ambiguity. The object was a ship, but not one shaped by commercial logic. The deck was broad and rectangular, almost empty, with only a small superstructure rising from one side. There were no visible cranes, no fishing gear, no civilian markings. The proportions belonged to a warship, and more specifically, to a floating airfield. The realization arrived silently and simultaneously among the divers. This was an aircraft carrier. Training asserts itself in moments like these. Panic is replaced by cataloging, length, width, orientation, the hull lines visible beneath the silt. Everything about the vessel suggested deliberate scuttling rather than violent destruction. There were no torpedo holes, no twisted metal, no evidence of fire. The ship had not been torn apart by battle. It had been emptied, sealed, and lowered into the dark with care. Even the paint, though aged, clung stubbornly to the metal, as if chosen not for speed but for endurance. One diver later admitted that the strangest sensation was not fear, but familiarity twisted into disbelief. Aircraft carriers were not myths. They were catalogued, counted, photographed from every angle during and after the Second World War. Their losses were recorded obsessively. Entire books existed just to track their fates. And yet this one sat here, where no registry placed it, where no battle report acknowledged its end. When the team returned to the surface, their voices remained controlled, almost clinical. The language used was technical, cautious, stripped of speculation. Coordinates were logged. Preliminary descriptions transmitted. Cousteau listened without interruption. There was no visible surprise in his expression, no demand for clarification. He asked for confirmation of dimensions, for notes on the hull condition, for estimates of age based on corrosion patterns. It was the demeanor of a man receiving expected information. Communication protocols activated immediately. The first detailed report did not go to French scientific authorities or media contacts. It went across encrypted channels to American analysts who had not set foot on the ice, but had been waiting nonetheless. Satellite imagery was requested and received. Overhead passes adjusted. The object on the seabed was cross-referenced against databases that, according to every official statement, should have returned nothing. And they did. The response from intelligence services was swift and unsettling in its simplicity. No aircraft carrier was listed as lost in that region. None unaccounted for anywhere else matched the description. Every navy with the capacity to build such a vessel had records extending back decades, and none pointed south. The implication was not merely that this ship was unknown, but that its existence disrupted the assumption of comprehensive historical accounting. Either records were incomplete in a way no one admitted, or this vessel had never been meant to enter history at all. Further dives deepened the unease. Access points into the interior revealed a hollowed structure. Compartments were stripped clean. Mountings remained where machinery should have been, bolts protruding like broken teeth. Cabling had been removed rather than severed. This was not abandonment under pressure. It was systematic evacuation. Even personal artifacts, the kind sailors inevitably leave behind in emergencies, were absent. The ship had been erased before being sunk. On the deck, attachment points appeared that did not align with standard carrier configurations from the 1940s. They suggested equipment heavier or different in purpose than conventional aircraft launch systems. Not experimental in a science fiction sense, but specialized, customized for a role not reflected in publicly known designs. One engineer noted that the spacing implied temporary installations, modular and removable, consistent with a platform intended to support operations that would later vanish without trace. Preservation raised further questions. Antarctic waters' slow corrosion, this was well known, but the degree of integrity exceeded expectations even with that factor considered. Barnacle growth was minimal in places, uneven in ways that hinted at a shorter submersion time than the decades implied by wartime origins. Quietly, among the technical staff, a possibility circulated. The ship might have been sunk not in the 1940s, but much later. Perhaps even within living memory. Above water, Cousteau grew increasingly withdrawn. Hours passed with him isolated in the control room, comparing sonar maps with satellite images, drawing lines between anomalies that only he and a handful of analysts could see. The official filming schedule continued, cameras capturing whales breaching against ice floes, penguins clustering along the shore. The contrast was almost surreal. Beauty and secrecy shared the same frame, but never acknowledged each other. Satellite data revealed irregularities inland, subtle depressions in the ice, zones where thickness measurements deviated from regional norms. These could be explained away individually as quirks of geology or climate, but taken together, they formed patterns. Patterns near the coordinates photographed decades earlier by German pilots. Patterns near where this ship now slept on the ocean floor. The possibility emerged that the carrier had not operated alone, that it had been part of a logistical system connecting sea to land, surface to subsurface. The presence of patrol vessels soon confirmed that time was limited. A ship bearing the markings of the nation controlling this sector appeared on the horizon, its approach polite but firm. Radio exchanges remained courteous, framed in the language of environmental protection and treaty compliance. The message beneath was unmistakable. This area was being watched, and prolonged curiosity was unwelcome. Cousteau complied. Orders were given to conclude operations. The final dives focused on documentation rather than exploration, capturing enough to preserve knowledge but not enough to provoke confrontation. Equipment was stowed, containers sealed. The ship turned away from the ice with an efficiency that felt practiced, as though departure itself had been anticipated from the moment of arrival. Yet the story did not end with withdrawal. On the return north, Calypso paused again, this time near the southern tip of South America. Officially, it was for resupply. Unofficially, a transfer occurred. 2 men arrived by small craft, unmarked and unintroduced. They spent hours with Cousteau, leaving with sealed metal cases whose contents were never inventoried publicly. No one asked. Everyone noticed. Back in France, the reception was muted. Authorities boarded before crowds could gather. Specific materials were confiscated under the language of international compliance and security review. They were never returned. The remaining footage became part of a polished documentary, a celebration of Antarctic life that omitted precisely one object, one set of coordinates, one sequence of days. The aircraft carrier remained where it was, unnamed, unclaimed, officially non-existent. But for those who had seen it, the ocean no longer felt empty. It felt curated, as if certain truths had been deliberately placed beyond reach, waiting for expeditions that knew where to look and when to leave. The trail did not begin in the cold water beneath Calypso, and it did not originate with the decisions made in 1972. It stretched backward through layers of time, through files yellowed by age and routes plotted with tools far less sophisticated than satellites. Long before sonar painted outlines of a white hull on the seabed, another expedition had traced the same coast with a very different purpose and an even heavier silence. The year was 1938, and Europe was already vibrating with the tension of an approaching war. On December 17th, a German vessel departed Hamburg under a scientific banner that concealed far more than it revealed. The ship was named Schwabenland, outwardly a cargo vessel, inwardly transformed into something closer to a mobile aviation platform. A catapult had been mounted on her deck, capable of launching seaplanes into the polar sky where no airfields existed. 2 Dornier flying boats rested aboard, their wings folded like patient birds, waiting to map territory few nations had ever seen directly. Official paperwork described a polar research mission intended to support the whaling industry, a vital economic interest for the Reich. Whales meant oil, oil meant industry, and industry meant power. The logic was sound enough to satisfy public scrutiny, but the pace of preparation betrayed urgency. Captain Alfred Richer received his command only months before departure, under strict instructions of secrecy. Crew lists included specialists whose biographies dissolved into ambiguity upon inspection. Some were labeled geologists or geomagnetism experts, terms broad enough to mask almost anything. Their faces would later vanish from archives as completely as if they had never existed. The financing told another story. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, provided funding and equipment. Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, personally oversaw aspects of preparation. Such attention from the uppermost layers of power was unnecessary for a whaling survey. It suggested interest in territory, technology, or knowledge that extended beyond oil and blubber. The presence of heavy metal markers among the cargo made the intention clearer. These were not flags. They were weighted steel pennants designed to be dropped from aircraft, driven deep into snow and ice to mark claims in a way that would endure long after fabric rotted away. Schwabenland reached Antarctic waters in January 1939, arriving at the edge of Queen Maud Land, a remote sector of the continent largely untouched by human presence. Over the following weeks, the expedition conducted 15 aerial reconnaissance flights. The pilots photographed hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, stitching together a visual record of coastlines, ice shelves, and inland features. Every 25 kilometers, the steel markers were dropped, each bearing the insignia of a regime intent on leaving its imprint on the planet's last unclaimed spaces. During one of these flights, something unexpected appeared beneath the cameras. A region devoid of ice, roughly 35 square kilometers in size, surrounded by glaciers like a wound that refused to freeze. Rocky hills rose from the ground, dotted with lakes of liquid water. The air temperature measured above zero, an anomaly in a land where -20 was considered mild. Patches of moss and lichen clung to the terrain, a rare hint of life in an otherwise sterile expanse. The phenomenon could be explained geologically through geothermal heat rising from below, but explanation did not diminish its strategic value. An ice-free oasis in Antarctica is more than a curiosity. It is shelter. It is access to fresh water. It is a place where equipment can be stored without being crushed by shifting ice. For planners thinking in terms of long-term presence rather than seasonal visits, such a location would be invaluable. The pilots photographed it extensively. Coordinates were logged with care. The area was marked not just on maps, but in memory. Officially, the expedition concluded and Schwabenland returned to Germany in April 1939. In practice, evidence of this return was curiously thin. There were no welcoming crowds documented, no triumphant headlines, no celebratory accounts. Reports and congratulations had already been transmitted while the ship was still near Antarctica, as if the outcome was known before the journey ended. After that, Schwabenland and her captain faded from records for years, reappearing only briefly in 1944 when the vessel was damaged by a British submarine and ran aground in the Baltic. Captain Richer himself vanished from documentation during the same period, a coincidence too precise to ignore. Additional fragments complicate the picture further. Canadian records show the sale of a powerful icebreaker to Germany in 1937, renamed and then lost to German documentation as though swallowed by a bureaucratic void. Icebreakers are not necessary for short reconnaissance missions. They are essential for sustained operations in polar regions, for escorting supply ships, and maintaining access through heavy ice. Alongside this icebreaker, at least 2 other vessels appear in peripheral records, their names obscured, their purposes undefined. Together they suggest a flotilla rather than a solitary research ship. If Schwabenland and her companions did not immediately return home, the implications are significant. A continued presence in Antarctica during the war years would have offered isolation from Allied surveillance and a location for activities meant to remain undiscovered. Submarine routes linking Europe, South America, and the Antarctic coast become plausible in this context. The German U-boats later found off Argentina, their arrival shrouded in post-war mystery, fit neatly into such a logistical chain. 7 years after Schwabenland's departure, another fleet arrived at the same frozen threshold. In 1946, the United States launched Operation Highjump, the largest military expedition Antarctica had ever seen. 13 ships, dozens of aircraft, and nearly 5,000 personnel descended on the southern continent under the command of Admiral Richard Byrd. Officially, the mission aimed to test equipment in extreme conditions and train personnel. Unofficially, the scale raised eyebrows even at the time. Training exercises rarely require aircraft carriers and submarines in such numbers. Byrd himself added to the unease. Years earlier, he had traveled to Germany with the intent of joining the 1938 expedition, only to withdraw abruptly without explanation. Now he returned as a military commander, equipped to search, confront, or secure something rather than merely observe it. Operation Highjump ended prematurely after only a few months. Equipment was lost. Men died. Official explanations blamed weather and logistical challenges, but rumors circulated of encounters that defied expectation. After Highjump, access to the region tightened. Patrols increased. Research permits became difficult to obtain. Antarctica, supposedly dedicated to peaceful scientific collaboration, developed pockets of quiet exclusion. Decades passed, and the memory of pre-war German flights and post-war American armadas receded into obscurity. By the time Cousteau arrived, the narrative had been sanitized. Antarctica was a realm of penguins and melting ice, not secret bases and lost fleets. Yet the continuity of location remained. The oasis photographed in 1939, the sector patrolled after 1946, the anomalies detected by satellites in the 1970s, and the white aircraft carrier resting offshore all occupied the same narrow band of coastline. History, stripped of coincidence, began to resemble choreography. Each expedition inherited the silence of the last, adding its own layer while pretending nothing had come before. What Cousteau encountered was not an isolated anomaly, but the physical residue of decisions made long before his birth, decisions embedded in steel, ice, and erased paperwork. The carrier on the seabed was not just a ship. It was a punctuation mark in a sentence that had been written, deleted, and rewritten across generations, always pointing back to the same frozen margin of the world. When the war ended in 1945, the world pretended that Antarctica had remained untouched by it. Maps were redrawn, borders were argued over elsewhere, and the frozen continent was framed as a neutral void, distant from the smoke and rubble of Europe. Yet neutrality is often a story told after the fact, a way to smooth over regions where too many interests briefly converged. In the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender, attention shifted not only to ruined cities and captured scientists, but also to places where assets might have been hidden far from advancing armies. Antarctica, isolated and poorly monitored, fit that requirement perfectly. Submarines arriving in South American ports during the final weeks of the war were treated as curiosities rather than clues. Crews surrendered, explanations were accepted, and official records filed them away as isolated incidents of delayed capitulation. But their routes, reconstructed later through logs and fuel calculations, traced arcs that brushed uncomfortably close to the southern ice. These vessels were capable of long-range travel and prolonged submersion, precisely the traits needed to maintain a supply corridor to a remote polar outpost. Their presence hinted at unfinished business, at something not entirely evacuated or destroyed when the Reich collapsed. In 1946, the United States moved with unusual speed. Operation Highjump was announced publicly as a training and testing exercise, but its composition suggested urgency. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, icebreakers, and transport ships converged under Admiral Richard Byrd's command. Byrd was no ordinary officer. He was a celebrated polar explorer, a man whose public persona blended heroism with scientific curiosity. That image made him an ideal figurehead for an operation that needed both credibility and discretion. The expedition's official tasks involved cold weather testing, mapping, and establishing procedures for potential future research. Yet the sheer scale of manpower and equipment exceeded what such goals required. 5,000 men do not assemble in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth merely to practice. They assemble to secure, recover, or neutralize something considered significant enough to justify the risk. Byrd's familiarity with the region, dating back to his aborted participation in the German expedition years earlier, positioned him as someone who understood what might be at stake. Highjump's abrupt end raised more questions than it answered. Planned for 8 months, it was terminated after barely 2. Official statements cited harsh weather and technical losses, but Antarctica's climate had not suddenly become more hostile than expected. Byrd himself gave interviews upon returning that hinted at threats emerging from the polar regions, spoken in a tone that mixed caution with disbelief. He described advanced capabilities, aircraft able to traverse vast distances at unprecedented speeds, statements later softened or dismissed as misinterpretations. The retractions did little to erase the impression that something unexpected had been encountered. Following Highjump, a quiet transformation occurred. Certain sectors of Antarctica became harder to access. Research proposals stalled in bureaucracy. Patrols increased under the banner of environmental protection. When the Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959, it enshrined peaceful use and scientific cooperation, but it also froze territorial claims in a way that preserved existing control. The language of cooperation masked a reality in which some areas were effectively managed by a single authority, their isolation justified by logistics and sensitivity. During the 1950s and 1960s, technological capabilities advanced rapidly. Sonar improved, satellites entered orbit, and the ocean floor became increasingly legible to those with the right instruments. A series of expeditions, nominally scientific, began mapping sections of the Southern Ocean in detail. Their results were rarely published in full. Data sets were summarized, generalized, or classified. The reasons offered ranged from national security to proprietary research methods. The pattern was consistent. The more precise the data, the less likely it was to be shared. By the time Cousteau prepared his Antarctic voyage, this layered secrecy had already shaped the landscape. The region he approached was not just environmentally sensitive, it was administratively guarded. Patrol ships enforced boundaries that existed more in practice than on paper. The discovery of a submerged aircraft carrier within this zone was therefore not simply an archaeological surprise. It was a breach, however brief, of a long-maintained perimeter. The carrier itself embodied the contradictions of the post-war world. Its design aligned with mid-20th century naval engineering, yet its condition suggested a lifespan that extended beyond the conflict it should have belonged to. The absence of identifying marks pointed to intentional anonymity. The white paint, unusual but practical in polar conditions, suggested planning specific to ice operations. This was not a relic that had wandered into Antarctic waters by accident. It was built, modified, and ultimately discarded with the environment in mind. As Cold War tensions intensified, the possibility of hidden installations or abandoned infrastructure in Antarctica took on new relevance. Any facility established during the war, whether German or later appropriated, would represent a technological and strategic inheritance. Control over such sites would matter, not because of what they symbolized, but because of what they might still contain. Machinery, documents, or simply proof of prior presence could disrupt carefully managed narratives of dominance and discovery. Cousteau's role in this continuum was paradoxical. Publicly, he embodied transparency, environmentalism, and shared knowledge. Privately, his expedition operated within constraints shaped by decades of strategic behavior. His agreement with American authorities, granting them first access to unusual findings, reflected a hierarchy of interest that placed geopolitical concerns above scientific openness. It also indicated trust, or at least mutual necessity, between parties who understood that certain discoveries could not be handled casually. The reaction to the carrier's discovery followed established precedent: containment over confrontation, removal of evidence rather than acknowledgement. The confiscation of materials upon Calypso's return mirrored earlier efforts to sanitize the historical record. What remained visible to the public was carefully curated, stripped of elements that might invite speculation. The message was subtle but firm. Some chapters of exploration were not meant to be read. The enduring mystery lay not in the existence of the carrier itself, but in the persistence of interest surrounding it. Decades after its presumed sinking, resources were still allocated to monitoring the area. Satellite passes continued. Permits were denied. The ocean floor, mapped elsewhere in ever-increasing detail, remained selectively blurred here. Such attention implied unresolved value, something not fully recovered or understood. In this context, Antarctica ceased to be merely a backdrop. It became an active participant in history, a place where actions could be hidden not through invisibility, but through remoteness and repetition. Expeditions came and went, each adding a layer of explanation that smoothed over the last, while the underlying structures, both physical and political, remained unchanged. The carrier rested in silence, its decks empty, its purpose undocumented. Around it, ice shifted, treaties aged, and generations passed. Above it, ships like Calypso arrived under banners of science and departed under the weight of unspoken agreements. The continuity suggested that whatever had drawn attention to this frozen margin had never fully released it, binding past and present in a quiet, enduring loop of secrecy. By the early 1970s, Antarctica had learned how to wear two faces at once. To the public, it was a pristine laboratory for climate science and a symbol of international cooperation, a continent protected by treaties and idealism. To governments and intelligence services, it remained a strategic blank space, one of the few places left on Earth where absence of infrastructure could be turned into an advantage. What mattered was not what was built openly, but what could be hidden quietly and forgotten convincingly. Into this layered landscape stepped Jacques-Yves Cousteau, carrying both the credibility of a global icon and the usefulness of a perfect cover. The strength of Cousteau's reputation lay in its predictability. Audiences expected wonder, calm narration, and a gentle warning about humanity's impact on nature. Authorities expected the same. A Cousteau expedition drew cameras, not suspicion. It framed movement through restricted waters as cultural enrichment rather than strategic maneuvering. This predictability made his presence valuable to those who needed access without attention. By the time Calypso crossed into the Southern Ocean, the expedition had already been absorbed into a narrative too familiar to be questioned. Behind that familiarity, however, was an operational structure that resembled earlier efforts more than anyone admitted. The cooperation agreement with American agencies did not exist in isolation. It reflected a continuation of post-war practices in which civilian expeditions served dual purposes. Scientists gathered data, while parallel channels evaluated anything that fell outside expected parameters. This arrangement did not require deception so much as selective emphasis. Nothing false needed to be said if the most important details were simply never mentioned. As Calypso worked along the Antarctic coast, the ship's internal rhythms revealed the duality of its mission. Days followed a visible schedule of filming and surface observations, carefully documented for later editing. Nights were quieter, dominated by instrument calibration, data comparison, and communication bursts that avoided routine broadcast channels. The crew sensed the difference without fully understanding it. Those assigned to cameras remained focused on wildlife. Those working with sonar and navigation felt the weight of expectation shift subtly toward precision rather than curiosity. The submerged aircraft carrier became the focal point of that shift. Once identified, it altered priorities instantly. The question was no longer whether something unusual existed, but how to manage the consequences of acknowledging it. The carrier's location placed it within a web of historical sensitivities. Any formal recognition would invite questions about ownership, origin, and responsibility, questions that would reach backward into unresolved wartime legacies and forward into Cold War rivalries. Silence, in this context, was not avoidance, but strategy. The response followed a familiar pattern. First came verification through independent means, primarily satellites. Then came compartmentalization. Only a small circle had access to the full picture. The rest received filtered explanations consistent with their roles. This approach minimized leaks not by intimidation, but by fragmentation. No single person outside the core group possessed enough information to reconstruct the whole story confidently. The decision not to salvage the carrier immediately was deliberate. Recovery would draw attention, require justification, and create records that could later be contested. Leaving it in place preserved ambiguity. A ship on the seabed without official acknowledgement occupied a liminal state, neither artifact nor asset. It could be monitored, revisited, or quietly stripped if necessary, all without triggering public discourse. Cousteau's behavior during this period reflected the tension inherent in his position. He was neither a soldier nor an intelligence officer, yet he operated within constraints shaped by both worlds. His authority aboard Calypso allowed him to enforce silence without explanation. His public persona shielded him from direct scrutiny. The cost was internal. Crew members noted his withdrawal, the way enthusiasm gave way to calculation. Exploration, for perhaps the first time in his career, had collided directly with boundaries he could not narrate away. The return journey underscored the careful choreography of concealment. The brief stop near the southern tip of South America was executed with efficiency and discretion. Transfers occurred without ceremony. Containers changed hands without labels. No formal logs recorded the contents. This was not theft or seizure, it was assimilation. Information and material were absorbed into systems designed to erase their origins. Back in Europe, the process continued. Confiscation was framed as temporary review, a language that implied compliance rather than coercion. The fact that materials were never returned became irrelevant once time passed and attention shifted. The finished documentary aired as expected, reinforcing the familiar image of Antarctica as a realm of ice, life, and vulnerability. The absence of the carrier from the narrative was invisible to viewers who never knew it had existed. The dissolution of the original crew completed the cycle. By dispersing witnesses, the likelihood of a unified account diminished rapidly. Memories diverged, details blurred, and confidence eroded. Isolated testimony, no matter how sincere, struggled against institutional silence. Over time, even those who had seen the carrier firsthand began to doubt the impact of their own experience, not its reality, but its significance. In the years that followed, attention returned intermittently to the region, always under different pretexts. New research stations appeared, their locations justified by logistical convenience or scientific opportunity. Patrol routes adjusted subtly. Satellite coverage increased in resolution and frequency. These actions were not reactive, they were maintenance. The area required oversight precisely because it had never been fully resolved. The carrier's continued presence served as a reminder of unfinished history. It represented a convergence of intentions from different eras, each layered atop the last without full disclosure. German ambition, American intervention, and Cold War pragmatism had all left traces, not only in documents and testimonies, but in steel resting quietly beneath Antarctic waters. What distinguished this episode from countless other classified operations was not its secrecy, but its persistence. Decades passed, technologies changed, governments fell and rose, yet the site remained relevant. That relevance suggested more than symbolic value. It implied that something about the carrier, its construction, its use, or its connection to land-based activity nearby continued to matter. In this light, Cousteau's expedition appears less as an anomaly and more as a checkpoint. It marked the moment when a hidden thread briefly surfaced into public adjacent space before being submerged again. The carrier did not need to be raised to exert influence. Its existence alone shaped behavior, policy, and access. Antarctica, vast and seemingly empty, proved once more that emptiness can be curated. What is left unspoken often defines history more powerfully than what is recorded. Beneath the ice and waves, The carrier remained, not as a relic awaiting discovery, but as a deliberate omission, anchored in place by decades of agreement that some stories are safer when they stay cold. As the years moved forward, the silence surrounding the Antarctic sector hardened into routine. What had once required explanation no longer did. Restricted zones existed because they always had. Permits were denied because procedures demanded caution. The language of environmental stewardship provided a perfect seal, one that discouraged curiosity by appealing to virtue. Few questioned why certain stretches of ice and sea were treated differently from countless others equally fragile. Fewer still connected these policies to events buried beneath decades of classified correspondence and unspoken precedent. Within naval and intelligence communities, the site acquired a different status. It was not named openly, but it was known. Coordinates were passed indirectly, referenced through code words or contextual markers rather than explicit numbers. Analysts rotated in and out, each inheriting fragments of a story that never quite formed a complete picture. Continuity was maintained not through documentation, but through practice. Procedures repeated often enough became tradition, and tradition replaced explanation. Technological advances during the late 20th century made concealment both easier and more complex. Satellites capable of resolving meters rather than kilometers transformed the ice into a readable surface, revealing subtle patterns in snow accumulation and melt. Oceanographic sensors mapped the seabed with increasing precision. Yet greater visibility did not lead to transparency. Instead, it necessitated stricter control. Data pipelines became selective, distributing clarity where it was harmless and blurring it where it was not. Independent researchers occasionally brushed against these invisible boundaries. Requests to survey certain underwater regions were delayed indefinitely. Funding proposals stalled without formal rejection. Expeditions were redirected under the guise of safety or logistics. The justifications were always reasonable in isolation. Taken together, they formed a perimeter that did not appear on any map. Those who studied the politics of polar governance noticed inconsistencies. The Antarctic Treaty emphasized openness and shared knowledge, yet exceptions proliferated quietly. Some stations operated with unusual autonomy, reporting irregularly or not at all. Others possessed infrastructure that exceeded their stated research goals. None of this constituted proof of wrongdoing. It did, however, suggest that Antarctica's neutrality was conditional, shaped by informal agreements layered atop formal ones. The submerged aircraft carrier played a central role in maintaining this condition. Its existence imposed constraints without requiring action. As long as it remained untouched, it posed no immediate risk of exposure. At the same time, it served as a reference point, a physical reminder anchoring policy decisions to something tangible. Raising it would force confrontation with questions no one wanted to answer. Leaving it where it was allowed ambiguity to persist. Over time, theories circulated within closed circles. Some framed the carrier as a logistical remnant, a support platform for operations that never fully materialized. Others suggested it had served as a mobile base linked to land installations now buried beneath ice. A minority entertained more speculative ideas involving experimental technologies or post-war contingencies that blurred the line between conventional military planning and desperation-driven innovation. None of these theories reached consensus. Consensus was unnecessary. What mattered was agreement on one point. The site warranted continued discretion. Cousteau's expedition became a reference case, cited obliquely when discussing risk. It demonstrated how easily an unexpected discovery could surface under the guise of civilian research. It also showed how effectively such a discovery could be contained if addressed quickly. Lessons were learned. Subsequent civilian expeditions operating near sensitive areas were guided more carefully, their routes influenced subtly through recommendations and support conditions. Access was shaped not by prohibition, but by convenience. Public interest in Antarctica grew during the same period, fueled by environmental awareness and climate science. Melting ice caps and rising sea levels dominated headlines. This focus further insulated historical anomalies from scrutiny. Attention was directed toward the future, toward models and projections, leaving little room for uncomfortable inquiries into the past. The continent became a symbol of global vulnerability rather than geopolitical complexity. Former members of Calypso's crew aged quietly. Some carried the memory of the carrier like a private burden, unsure how to articulate its significance even to themselves. Without documents or corroboration, memory alone felt insufficient. Occasional attempts to share fragments of the story were met with polite skepticism. Time, the most effective filter, softened edges and blurred urgency. The individual most closely associated with the discovery remained publicly silent. Cousteau's later years were filled with advocacy, lectures, and a continued emphasis on preservation. When Antarctica was mentioned, it was framed in familiar terms: beauty, fragility, responsibility. The absence of any reference to the anomalous find was conspicuous only to those who knew to look for it. To everyone else, it reinforced the perception that nothing unusual had occurred. Yet silence does not erase influence. Policy decisions continued to align with the unspoken need to control that sector. Advances in autonomous underwater vehicles prompted internal discussions about their deployment near the site. The consensus leaned toward caution. Autonomous systems produced data difficult to intercept once released. Human-operated missions, by contrast, could be supervised, redirected, and briefed afterward. Technology was managed not only for capability, but for controllability. As the Cold War ended and new global dynamics emerged, the logic of secrecy adapted rather than disappeared. National competition gave way to multinational collaboration in some arenas, but Antarctica remained an exception. Cooperation there was carefully staged. Joint missions occurred, but their scopes were negotiated with precision. Shared data sets were curated. Trust existed, but it was bounded. The carrier, still resting in darkness, became less a relic of a specific nation and more a shared liability. Its origins mattered less than the precedent its exposure would set. Acknowledging it would invite demands for explanation that could unravel other carefully maintained narratives. It was easier to treat it as a geological anomaly in bureaucratic terms, an object best left unclassified because classification itself would imply acknowledgement. This approach required periodic reinforcement. Patrol routes were adjusted. Surveillance was updated. Environmental impact assessments were invoked whenever access was requested nearby. None of these measures were extraordinary on their own. Together, they formed a system that functioned smoothly precisely because it avoided dramatic action. Antarctica's power as a hiding place lay not in its hostility, but in its remoteness. Distance diluted urgency. Ice slowed decay. The absence of witnesses reduced accountability. The carrier benefited from all three. It did not need guards or fences. The environment itself served as both vault and curtain. In this context, the story ceased to be about a single ship. It became about how history is managed when physical evidence contradicts official memory. The carrier remained where it was, exerting quiet pressure on decisions made far away, shaping behavior without ever appearing in textbooks or documentaries. Its presence was felt not through revelation, but through restraint, a constant reminder that some discoveries are never meant to surface. By the time the 21st century approached, the Antarctic mystery had aged into something more resilient than secrecy: normalization. What once demanded justification now existed as institutional habit. New generations of analysts, researchers, and officers inherited procedures without inheriting context. They knew where not to go, what data to summarize, which requests to slow down. Few of them understood why. They did not need to. Systems endure not because everyone believes in them, but because they continue to function. Advances in digital archiving and historical transparency created an unexpected tension. As more wartime documents were declassified across Europe and North America, historians began to notice gaps that could not be explained by routine loss or damage, shipping manifests that ended abruptly, personnel records that skipped entire years, vessels that appeared in foreign registries without corresponding domestic files. On their own, these omissions seemed mundane. Together they formed negative space, outlines of something missing rather than something present. The German Antarctic expedition of 1938-1939 attracted renewed scholarly interest. Its photographs were re-examined with modern techniques, revealing details previously overlooked. Terrain features were matched against satellite imagery, confirming the location of the ice-free oasis with greater precision than ever before. The region had not changed significantly, despite decades of ice movement. Its continued existence reinforced the idea that it was not a transient anomaly, but a stable feature. Yet access to the area remained limited, controlled through a web of environmental and logistical restrictions. At the same time, interest in post-war German naval activity resurfaced. The fate of certain vessels remained unresolved in official histories. Submarines accounted for themselves through surrender records, but surface ships left fewer traces. The disappearance of Schwabenland from documentation between 1939 and 1944 became harder to dismiss as clerical error. Researchers proposed benign explanations: reassignment, renaming, capture. None could be substantiated conclusively. Parallel investigations into Operation Highjump produced similar frustration. The expedition was well documented in terms of logistics and personnel, yet curiously vague about outcomes. Reports focused on ice conditions, equipment performance, and flight operations, avoiding detailed discussion of findings. Byrd's ambiguous public statements remained unexplained, their context lost amid official retractions. The possibility that Highjump encountered something unexpected persisted not because of sensationalism, but because the record felt incomplete. Within intelligence communities, these historical inquiries were monitored with mild concern. None threatened immediate exposure, but they risked convergence. Independent lines of research, when combined, could approach sensitive territory. The solution was not suppression, but dilution. Alternative explanations were encouraged. Emphasis was placed on environmental phenomena, geological oddities, and the psychological strain of polar exploration. Those narratives were not false. They were simply sufficient to redirect attention. The submerged aircraft carrier occupied a unique position in this evolving landscape. Unlike documents, it could not be declassified gradually or reinterpreted rhetorically. It existed in physical space, immune to revision. Its continued concealment depended entirely on controlling access. As deep-sea technology became more accessible, this control required adaptation. Private companies and academic institutions began deploying remotely operated vehicles capable of descending to depths once reserved for state actors. Regulatory frameworks expanded in response. New guidelines governed underwater exploration in Antarctic waters, citing ecological sensitivity and preservation of historical artifacts. These rules were broad, intentionally so, granting authorities discretion to deny permits without explicit reference to specific sites. Compliance was high, partly because the scientific community valued access elsewhere, and partly because the justifications aligned with widely held ethical principles. Occasionally, data slipped through. Anomalies appeared in publicly released bathymetric maps, subtle but noticeable to trained eyes. Flat expanses where natural formations should be irregular, abrupt transitions in seabed texture. These features sparked discussion in specialist forums where hypotheses ranged from ancient glacial activity to sedimentary quirks. The carrier itself was never named, but its absence from explanation created a quiet undercurrent of suspicion. Former crew members of Calypso observed these developments from afar. Some recognized echoes of what they had witnessed decades earlier. Others chose not to look too closely, content to let the past remain compartmentalized. The passage of time had transformed their experience from potential evidence into personal memory, something that could be questioned without consequence. One figure, André Laban, attempted to resist this erosion. Years after the expedition, he shared his account with a journalist known for exploring neglected historical corners. His description of the carrier was precise, technical, and restrained. He avoided speculation, focusing on what he had seen and measured. The story was published in a limited circulation book, quickly dismissed by mainstream reviewers as conjecture layered on anecdote. The dismissal was effective not because it disproved the account, but because it marginalized it. Laban's subsequent disappearance from public view added another layer of ambiguity. Whether by choice or circumstance, his silence reinforced the fragility of isolated testimony. Without institutional backing, individual voices struggled to persist. The story of the carrier retreated once more into obscurity, surviving only in fragments shared quietly among those inclined to listen. Meanwhile, Antarctica's role in global narratives continued to evolve. Climate change transformed it into a symbol of planetary urgency. Scientific stations multiplied, international cooperation intensified, and data flowed more freely than ever in certain domains. This openness, paradoxically, made selective closure less visible. When most information is available, the absence of a small portion draws less attention. The region associated with the carrier benefited from this effect. Research flourished elsewhere, producing groundbreaking insights into ice dynamics and ecosystems. Comparisons reinforced the notion that restricted zones were exceptions justified by practical considerations. Few questioned why these exceptions persisted unchanged while the rest of the continent opened up. The aircraft carrier remained untouched, its white hull slowly merging with the surrounding sediment. It no longer needed active concealment. Its isolation was sufficient. The ocean floor became its archive, preserving it in a state of suspended relevance. It was neither lost nor found, neither acknowledged nor denied. This state of limbo reflected a broader truth about historical management. Not all secrets are guarded by force. Some are protected by fatigue, by the accumulation of more urgent concerns, by the assumption that if something truly mattered, it would have surfaced already. The carrier contradicted that assumption quietly, existing as proof that absence from discourse does not equate to absence from reality. As decades passed, the narrative surrounding Antarctica stabilized. It was a place of science, cooperation, and caution. The anomalies embedded in its history became footnotes, if they were remembered at all. The carrier, the oasis, the unexplained expeditions formed a constellation visible only to those willing to connect points others preferred to leave unjoined, and in that selective vision, the past remained present, waiting without urgency, confident in the endurance of cold and distance. Distance has a way of dulling suspicion. Antarctica benefits from this more than any other place on Earth. It sits beyond ordinary travel, beyond routine oversight, and beyond the emotional geography most people inhabit. When something unusual is reported there, it is often absorbed into the general expectation of strangeness. Ice does strange things. Weather behaves unpredictably. Instruments malfunction. In such an environment, anomaly feels normal, and normality becomes flexible enough to absorb almost anything. This psychological buffer proved invaluable as the decades progressed. The submerged aircraft carrier, once a point of active concern, gradually transitioned into a managed variable. It did not need to be erased. It only needed to be contextualized into irrelevance. That process did not happen through denial, but through narrative displacement. Other stories took center stage. Melting ice shelves, ozone holes, emperor penguin colonies. Each was real, urgent, and worthy of attention. Together, they filled the available space for curiosity. Within specialized circles, however, the carrier never fully disappeared. It re-emerged occasionally during internal reviews of Antarctic logistics and contingency planning. Its coordinates served as a quiet reference when discussing exclusion zones or satellite tasking priorities. The object itself was rarely mentioned directly. Instead, it was implied through phrases like known underwater feature or legacy structure. Such language neutralized its implications, stripping it of historical agency and recasting it as inert geography. Technological shifts at the turn of the millennium introduced new challenges. Commercial satellite imagery became available to the public, and oceanographic data sets were shared online with unprecedented openness. Amateur analysts, equipped with tools once reserved for professionals, began scrutinizing remote regions with fresh eyes. Patterns emerged. Certain data tiles were consistently lower resolution. Update frequencies varied without clear explanation. For most users, these discrepancies went unnoticed. For a few, they raised quiet alarms. Discussions appeared in niche forums and academic side channels. Participants speculated about reasons for selective data degradation. Military testing, environmental protection, legacy contamination. Each theory carried just enough plausibility to sustain debate without converging on a single conclusion. The absence of definitive answers prevented momentum. Conversations drifted, resurfaced briefly, then faded again. Meanwhile, the physical environment continued its slow work. Sediment accumulated along the carrier's deck. Microorganisms colonized exposed surfaces. Ice movement altered local currents, subtly reshaping the seabed around the hull. These changes further integrated the ship into its surroundings, making it less distinct even to sonar. Nature, indifferent to secrecy, participated in concealment by default. On land, the ice-free oasis identified decades earlier remained largely untouched. Its existence was acknowledged in geological literature, described cautiously and without emphasis. Access remained restricted, justified by environmental sensitivity and logistical difficulty. Few researchers pressed the issue. Opportunities elsewhere on the continent were plentiful, and funding bodies favored projects with predictable outcomes. Risk, whether scientific or political, rarely aligned with grant proposals. The interplay between neglect and protection created a stable equilibrium. The carrier and its associated sites were neither actively hidden nor openly explored. They existed in a gray zone, sustained by inertia. To disrupt that equilibrium would require either a dramatic discovery or a deliberate decision to revisit old questions. Neither seemed likely. The former depended on chance. The latter demanded political will. Cousteau's legacy intersected with this equilibrium in a subtle way. His work continued to inspire new generations of explorers and environmental advocates. His name became synonymous with transparency and wonder. This association acted retroactively, reinforcing the assumption that nothing extraordinary had been omitted from his Antarctic expedition. The idea that a figure so publicly committed to sharing knowledge could have encountered and suppressed something significant felt counterintuitive to many. Reputation, once established, became a form of insulation. Yet reputations are shaped as much by absence as by presence. The lack of follow-up expeditions to the same Antarctic sector under Cousteau's banner stood out quietly. Other regions were revisited, filmed, and discussed. This one remained a single chapter, closed without sequel. The omission blended into the broader arc of his career, unnoticed by most but suggestive to those who tracked patterns rather than headlines. In the intelligence world, the site's value continued to be reassessed periodically. Analysts rotated, perspectives shifted, but the conclusion remained consistent. Exposure carried more risk than benefit. Whatever knowledge the carrier might yield, it was unlikely to justify reopening questions tied to wartime conduct, post-war interventions, and treaty-era compromises. Stability favored silence. This calculation extended beyond any single nation. Over time, the carrier became a shared inconvenience. Multiple states had reasons to prefer ambiguity. Shared silence required no formal agreement. It emerged naturally from overlapping interests. Each actor assumed the others preferred the status quo, and so the status quo persisted. Occasional technological proposals threatened this balance. Concepts for comprehensive seabed mapping, global ocean inventories, or autonomous survey swarms raised internal concerns. Such initiatives promised unprecedented clarity, but clarity is not always welcome. In response, exceptions were written into frameworks, carve-outs justified by conservation ethics or operational safety. The language was neutral. The effect was precise. For the broader public, Antarctica remained a canvas for projection. It symbolized humanity's capacity for cooperation or its vulnerability to environmental collapse, depending on context. These narratives were powerful, emotionally resonant, and forward-looking. They left little room for unresolved historical anomalies. The past, especially one involving secrecy and military ambition, felt out of place amid discussions of melting ice and global responsibility. And yet, the past persisted physically. Steel does not forget. Paint flakes, but structure remains. The carrier lay where it had been placed, unchanged in purpose even as its meaning evolved. It no longer functioned as a vessel or a base. It functioned as a constraint, a quiet boundary shaping behavior without announcing itself. In this way, the carrier achieved a kind of permanence that active use could never provide. It influenced decisions precisely because it was inactive. It demanded maintenance not through repair, but through continued avoidance. Its power lay in the questions it would raise if acknowledged, questions too interconnected to answer cleanly. Antarctica, vast and seemingly empty, proved once again that emptiness is rarely accidental. Spaces are left unfilled for reasons, sometimes strategic, sometimes psychological. The carrier occupied such a space, an object defined as much by what surrounded it as by what it was. And as long as ice and distance continued to cooperate, it would remain where history had left it, waiting without urgency, embedded in the continent's quiet complicity. What lingered beneath the ice was not merely a ship, but a contradiction, and contradictions have a way of resurfacing when conditions shift. As global systems grew more interconnected, the logic that had sustained Antarctic silence began to strain. Information no longer moved in neat channels controlled by a handful of institutions. It flowed sideways, recombined, and reinterpreted. A single data leak meant little. A pattern of minor leaks, correlated over time, began to suggest shape. Oceanographic initiatives in the late 2000s aimed to standardize global seabed mapping. Public-facing summaries emphasized navigation safety and climate modeling, while raw data sets were released in stages. In these releases, attentive observers noticed that certain Antarctic sectors remained oddly unresolved. Not blank, but smoothed. The texture lacked the granularity visible elsewhere at comparable depths. The explanation cited technical limitations, yet similar depths in harsher conditions had been mapped more clearly. The discrepancy was subtle enough to escape most notice, but not all. Independent analysts, some with backgrounds in geophysics or naval history, began cross-referencing these data with historical expedition routes. When plotted together, old and new information overlapped in suggestive ways. The region avoided by modern mapping coincided with the flight paths of German seaplanes in 1939, the operational area of Operation Highjump in 1946, and the track of Calypso in 1972. Individually, these overlaps could be dismissed. Collectively, they hinted at continuity. At the same time, renewed interest in Cold War history brought fresh attention to the mechanisms of secrecy itself. Declassified documents revealed how easily civilian programs had been leveraged for strategic ends. Weather stations doubled as listening posts. Research grants concealed reconnaissance objectives. These revelations normalized the idea that scientific exploration and intelligence gathering had long shared porous boundaries. Against this backdrop, the notion that a documentary expedition might intersect with classified interests seemed less far-fetched. The aircraft carrier's physical characteristics, reconstructed from surviving descriptions, became a focal point for analysis. Naval architects consulted informally noted inconsistencies with standard carrier classes. The deck configuration suggested adaptability rather than mass production. The hull proportions aligned with mid-century construction, yet the absence of identifiable features implied customization. This was not unprecedented. Wartime exigency had produced hybrid vessels, prototypes, and one-off designs. Many were documented, some were not. Speculation coalesced around the idea of the carrier as infrastructure rather than weapon. A mobile platform supporting activities that required isolation and flexibility. This interpretation aligned with the stripped interior and modular deck fittings observed by the divers. It also aligned with the choice of white paint, optimized for concealment in polar environments. The ship's design seemed to prioritize discretion over combat. If the carrier had served as a logistical node, its connection to land-based operations became increasingly plausible. The ice-free oasis identified decades earlier provided a rare anchor point. From there, activities could radiate outward, supported by sea and air. The carrier could ferry equipment, personnel, or experimental systems, then retreat beyond reach when no longer needed. Its eventual scuttling would erase the most visible link, leaving only fragments embedded in geography. Such scenarios did not require exotic technology or implausible motives. They required only the recognition that Antarctica offered advantages unavailable elsewhere. Distance reduced oversight. Ice preserved materials. Treaty frameworks discouraged militarization while inadvertently enabling concealment under the guise of neutrality. These factors made the continent uniquely suited for projects that benefited from being out of sight and out of mind. As these interpretations circulated quietly, institutional responses remained measured. No public denials were issued because no public accusations had crystallized. The strategy was one of patience. Without definitive proof, speculation could be allowed to dissipate naturally. The carrier's continued inaccessibility ensured that proof remained elusive. Environmental change introduced an unpredictable variable. Melting ice altered currents and exposed previously inaccessible areas. While the carrier lay offshore, shifts in sediment patterns raised concerns about eventual exposure. Internal assessments considered scenarios in which natural processes might reveal more of the hull or surrounding features. Contingency plans focused on mitigation through monitoring rather than intervention. Active recovery was still deemed too risky. Technological democratization continued. Universities acquired deep-sea vehicles. Private companies explored polar tourism and research partnerships. Each new actor increased the complexity of control. Rather than tightening restrictions overtly, authorities refined influence subtly. Advisory panels emphasized fragile ecosystems. Insurance requirements discouraged ambitious dives. Liability concerns nudged projects towards safer, approved zones. The effectiveness of these measures depended on a shared assumption that Antarctica's most compelling stories were environmental, not historical. This assumption held strong. Climate narratives dominated media and academic discourse. The urgency of melting ice overshadowed curiosity about sunken steel. The future demanded attention. The past receded further. Yet memory persisted in unconventional forms. Digitized archives allowed disparate materials to coexist in ways they never had physically. A photograph here, a flight log there, a sonar anomaly elsewhere. individually innocuous, together evocative. Online communities formed around pattern recognition rather than advocacy. Their discussions avoided sensationalism, focusing instead on methodological rigor. This restraint lent them credibility within niche circles, even as mainstream attention remained absent. Former officials occasionally encountered these discussions and recognized familiar contours. Their reactions were rarely alarmist. Time had softened the stakes. Whatever the carrier once represented, it no longer threatened immediate strategic balance. The primary concern was precedent. Acknowledging one anomaly might invite scrutiny of others. Silence remained the simplest option. The paradox was that the carrier's significance increased precisely because it was unresolved. It became a symbol of how history can be shaped by omission as effectively as by declaration. Its presence forced a reconsideration of Antarctic narratives, suggesting layers beneath the surface that resisted simplification. In this sense, the carrier was less an object than a lens. Through it, the interplay of science, strategy, and storytelling came into focus. It demonstrated how exploration could be both genuine and instrumental, how discovery could be celebrated and suppressed simultaneously. It illustrated the durability of decisions made quietly and maintained through habit rather than enforcement. As the second decade of the new century unfolded, the carrier remained where it had always been, its outline softened by sediment and time. Above it, ice thinned and refroze, treaties were reaffirmed, and data sets expanded. The world changed in visible ways. Beneath the surface, one unchanged fact persisted. A ship without a name continued to shape behavior without ever entering the official record. A silent witness to the power of managed absence. As attention drifted toward the accelerating pace of environmental change, Antarctica became framed less as a stage for hidden history and more as a warning for the future. Ice loss, rising seas, and fragile ecosystems dominated discourse, reshaping funding priorities and public imagination. This shift proved advantageous for everything that preferred to remain unexamined. When a place is perceived primarily as a victim of climate dynamics, it is rarely scrutinized as a theater of strategic decisions made long ago. Scientific infrastructure expanded rapidly under this new mandate. Stations were upgraded, sensors deployed, and long-term monitoring programs established. Data flowed outward in unprecedented volume, reinforcing the perception of openness. Yet, openness was selective. The most detailed instruments were not evenly distributed. High-resolution surveys clustered in regions of immediate climatic interest, while other zones remained comparatively coarse in representation. This unevenness was rationalized through cost, accessibility, and relevance, explanations that satisfied oversight bodies without provoking deeper inquiry. The area associated with the submerged aircraft carrier benefited from this recalibration. Its climatic profile did not stand out dramatically. Ice behavior there followed regional norms. There were no spectacular calving events or anomalous temperature spikes demanding urgent study. In the hierarchy of environmental crises, it ranked low. This lowered its visibility further, embedding it within the background of routine monitoring. Behind the scenes, the site's status continued to be reassessed quietly. Advances in materials science prompted questions about the long-term integrity of the hull. Models predicted gradual degradation, but at a pace slow enough to allow decades of continued neglect. Corrosion in cold, low-oxygen waters progressed unevenly. Structural collapse was unlikely in the near term. This assessment reassured those responsible for oversight. Time remained an ally. The question of whether to intervene proactively resurfaced periodically. Arguments for recovery emphasized historical clarity and the opportunity to resolve lingering ambiguities. Arguments against focused on diplomatic risk and precedent. Recovering the carrier would not simply answer technical questions. It would reopen narratives tied to wartime ambition, post-war operations, and treaty-era compromises. The potential fallout extended beyond any single nation, touching on shared myths of Antarctic innocence. Thus, inaction prevailed. Monitoring replaced engagement. Sensors tracked changes without touching the object itself. Satellite imagery watched from above, ensuring that no unauthorized activity occurred nearby. The carrier became an anomaly managed through distance rather than denial. Meanwhile, reinterpretations of historical expeditions gained traction in academic circles. Scholars emphasized the logistical challenges and improvisational nature of early polar exploration. This framing recast inconsistencies as byproducts of limited technology and chaotic conditions, rather than deliberate secrecy. Such interpretations were not unfounded. Polar expeditions were, by necessity, complex and error-prone. Yet this emphasis on disorder conveniently softened the edges of patterns that otherwise appeared deliberate. In popular culture, Antarctica remained largely abstract. Films and documentaries portrayed it as a place of extremes, stripped of human complexity. When history appeared, it focused on heroism and endurance, not strategy. This aesthetic choice reinforced the idea that Antarctica existed outside normal historical causality. Events there were exceptions, not expressions of broader systems. The carrier's invisibility thus became reinforced on multiple levels. Scientifically, it was a low-priority anomaly. Politically, it was a shared inconvenience. Culturally, it was incompatible with prevailing narratives. Each layer supported the others, creating a stable configuration resistant to disruption. Occasional challenges emerged from unexpected quarters. Artists and writers, drawn to liminal spaces, began incorporating Antarctic themes into speculative works. Some hinted at hidden installations or forgotten expeditions, using fiction to explore possibilities history had not confirmed. These stories attracted niche audiences, but were dismissed easily as imagination. Fiction, by its nature, provided plausible deniability. It allowed exploration without obligation. Within intelligence and defense circles, generational turnover further diluted urgency. The individuals who had direct knowledge of earlier operations retired or passed away. Their successors inherited summaries rather than experiences. Without emotional investment, the carrier became one item among many in risk assessments. Its uniqueness faded as new concerns emerged elsewhere in the world. This generational shift altered the tone of internal discussions. Where earlier analysts spoke of the carrier with caution, rooted in proximity to past decisions, later ones treated it as a historical artifact whose relevance had diminished. The conclusion remained the same, but the reasoning changed. Silence was no longer maintained to avoid exposure. It was maintained because engagement seemed unnecessary. The persistence of the carrier nonetheless continued to exert subtle influence. When proposals arose for comprehensive, high-resolution mapping of the entire Antarctic seabed, carve-outs appeared. Pilot projects avoided certain sectors. The justifications cited technical constraints or incremental rollout strategies. Over time, these exclusions became normalized, their origins forgotten. In this way, the carrier shaped future planning without direct acknowledgement. It was not a threat or a resource. It was a constraint, a boundary condition shaping models and policies. Its impact was indirect but enduring. The irony lay in the contrast between scale and effect. A single ship, long inactive, influenced decisions spanning decades and institutions. It demonstrated how material objects can anchor narratives even when they remain unseen. The carrier's continued presence testified to the inertia of secrecy, the way decisions, once made, propagate forward through habit rather than conscious choice. As environmental change accelerated and attention focused increasingly on mitigation and adaptation, the likelihood of revisiting old mysteries diminished further. The future demanded resources, and the past offered only uncertainty. The carrier, resting in cold darkness, exemplified that trade-off. It remained a problem best solved by leaving it unsolved. Antarctica's image as a laboratory of climate science solidified. This image was not false, but it was incomplete. Beneath measurements of ice thickness and temperature lay a quieter layer of history, one that shaped where scientists could look and what they could ask. The carrier belonged to that layer, an artifact whose silence spoke through the structures built to keep it that way. Time continued its work. Ice advanced and retreated. Data accumulated. Narratives hardened. And beneath it all, the unnamed ship endured, exerting influence not through presence, but through the careful management of its absence from collective memory. At some point, every long-kept silence begins to depend less on enforcement and more on belief. By the time the carrier had rested on the Antarctic seabed for half a century, belief had done most of the work. The belief that everything worth knowing had already been discovered. The belief that if something extraordinary existed, it would have been acknowledged by now. These assumptions acted as quiet guardians, far more effective than patrols or classified stamps. Institutions adapted to this belief without ever articulating it. Training materials for polar researchers emphasized protocol, safety, and ethics, but rarely history beyond heroic age narratives. Students learned about Shackleton and Amundsen, not about the geopolitical maneuvering of the mid-20th century. The absence of that context was not framed as omission, it was framed as focus. Antarctica became a place where history began and ended with endurance, not intention. This narrowing of perspective shaped how new information was interpreted. When unusual readings appeared in data sets, they were treated as technical noise or natural variability unless they fit existing models. Outliers were smoothed, averaged, or deprioritized. This was not deception. It was methodology. Science advances by filtering chaos into patterns, and in doing so, it sometimes filters away the very anomalies that demand explanation. The carrier benefited from this epistemic filtering. Sonar returns that hinted at artificial geometry were classified as ambiguous. Resolution limits provided plausible deniability. Without repeated confirmation, anomalies failed to accumulate significance. Each instance stood alone, easily dismissed. Accumulation, the engine of curiosity, never quite occurred. The people most capable of recognizing the pattern were those who straddled disciplines. historians with technical literacy, engineers with archival instincts. A few such individuals attempted synthesis, drawing tentative lines between expeditions, treaties, and technological developments. Their work circulated quietly, often in preprints or conference side discussions. It was received politely and set aside. Without institutional endorsement, synthesis remained speculative by default. The absence of conflict around the issue further reduced its visibility. There were no whistleblowers, no leaks framed as revelations. Silence persisted not because dissent was crushed, but because dissent never fully coalesced. Everyone involved possessed only fragments, insufficient to compel action. Fragmentation was the most durable form of containment. As years passed, the Antarctic governance framework evolved incrementally. New environmental protocols were added, emphasizing preservation of historical sites. Ironically, this language could apply to the carrier itself if it were ever acknowledged. Yet acknowledgement would transform it from an unknown to a protected artifact, drawing precisely the attention that had long been avoided. Thus, preservation became another argument for non-recognition. The logic extended to educational outreach. Public-facing materials celebrated transparency and international cooperation, reinforcing trust in the system. Trust reduced scrutiny. When institutions are perceived as benevolent, their blind spots are interpreted as limitations rather than choices. The Antarctic program enjoyed such trust, earned through decades of valuable scientific contribution. Meanwhile, technology continued to change how history could be reconstructed. Machine learning tools analyzed vast archives, identifying correlations humans overlooked. Applied to shipping records, expedition logs, and meteorological data, these tools occasionally produced intriguing alignments. Yet algorithms, like humans, depend on input. Where records were missing, models filled gaps probabilistically, often defaulting to benign explanations. The carrier's absence from data sets thus propagated forward. What is not recorded becomes statistically unlikely over time. The longer the silence persisted, the more improbable the anomaly appeared within reconstructed narratives. This feedback loop reinforced dismissal. The carrier became less real with each passing year, not physically, but epistemologically. Cultural memory followed a similar trajectory. As the generation directly involved in mid-century polar operations faded, their stories lost immediacy. Oral histories that mentioned unusual directives or unexplained detours sounded increasingly archaic. Without corroborating documents, they were filed under personal recollection rather than historical evidence. Memory, unanchored, drifted. Yet memory has a way of resurfacing indirectly. Occasionally, a photograph would be rediscovered, a marginal note re-examined, a coordinate reinterpreted. These moments sparked brief curiosity, quickly absorbed into the flow of academic life. Conferences moved on. Journals filled new pages. The carrier remained untouched, its story deferred indefinitely. This deferral had consequences beyond the site itself. It shaped how Antarctica was conceptualized as a whole. The continent was treated as a blank canvas for future science, rather than a palimpsest layered with unresolved pasts. This framing simplified governance and collaboration, but it also obscured continuity. Decisions made in one era silently influenced another, without explicit acknowledgement. The persistence of the carrier illustrated this continuity starkly. It was a material remnant of intentions that no longer had advocates, yet still constrained behavior. It demonstrated that history does not require belief to exert force. It requires only unresolved presence. As climate models projected accelerating change, the calculus shifted subtly. Some internal assessments noted that environmental transformation could eventually expose or destabilize long-hidden objects. The carrier's fate under such scenarios was considered abstractly. Containment strategies focused on documentation rather than disclosure. Preparing for visibility without preparing for explanation became a paradoxical goal. This paradox defined the carrier's status entering the modern era. It was simultaneously irrelevant and consequential. Irrelevant to daily operations, consequential to boundary setting. It shaped where lines were drawn, even as those drawing the lines forgot why they existed. The silence surrounding it was no longer active secrecy. It was institutional amnesia layered atop inherited caution. No one needed to order suppression. The system suppressed itself through habit, trust, and fragmentation. Antarctica, often described as timeless, revealed itself as deeply temporal in this way. Its ice preserved not only climate records but decisions, their effects frozen into policy and practice. The carrier lay beneath this icebound system, a fixed point anchoring decades of unspoken alignment. In the end, the most remarkable aspect of the carrier was not its construction or concealment, but its endurance as an idea unacknowledged. It survived not because it was defended, but because it was never fully confronted. And in that avoidance, it continued to shape a continent defined, paradoxically, by what it chose not to remember. By the time half a century had passed since the carrier slipped beneath Antarctic waters, its existence no longer belonged to the category of secrets actively guarded. It had become something more subtle and far more stable, a fixed assumption embedded into the way the continent was handled. No memo needed to mention it. No directive needed to reference it. Decisions simply curved around an invisible center of gravity that few people consciously acknowledged, but many instinctively respected. Antarctica, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, was increasingly defined by urgency. Ice cores spoke of accelerating change. Satellite graphs turned seasonal melt into alarming trajectories. Funding flowed toward models that could predict futures rather than interrogate pasts. In this environment, unresolved historical anomalies felt irrelevant, even irresponsible. Why look backward when the ice itself seemed to be running out of time? This shift altered institutional priorities in quiet but decisive ways. Archival work lost prestige compared to data-driven climate science. Logbooks, correspondence, and marginal notes from older expeditions were digitized unevenly, often without context. Documents survived, but the threads connecting them frayed. A flight path here, a sonar log there, an unexplained detour elsewhere. Without synthesis, they became noise rather than signal. The carrier's story depended entirely on synthesis. No single document declared its purpose. No photograph announced its origin. Meaning existed only in the overlap. German aerial surveys from 1939, the sudden scale of an American military expedition in 1946, the constrained silence following Cousteau's discovery in 1972. Each fragment alone could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern too uncomfortable to foreground. Specialization worked against that pattern. Modern research rewarded narrow expertise. A geophysicist rarely read naval history. A historian rarely analyzed sonar returns. The spaces between disciplines, where the carrier's outline emerged most clearly, remained underexplored. This was not suppression. It was structural indifference. Environmental governance reinforced this indifference with moral authority. Expanding protected areas around Antarctica limited access under the banner of preservation. These policies were widely supported and genuinely necessary. Yet they also had the effect of freezing inquiry. Salvage became ethically suspect. Archaeological interest was subordinated to conservation. The carrier, resting within increasingly protected waters, slipped neatly into this framework. Non-intervention became a virtue. The language changed, but the outcome remained constant. Where once security concerns justified restriction, now ecological sensitivity did the same work. The rationale evolved, the boundary did not. The carrier benefited from this continuity, its isolation reframed as stewardship rather than control. Technological forecasting added further reassurance. Models suggested the hull would remain structurally intact for decades. Cold, low-oxygen water slowed decay. Sediment accumulation increased stability. There was no imminent risk of collapse, no looming exposure. Time appeared abundant. With no deadline imposed by nature, institutions felt no pressure to decide. Later became the default answer. Later, when technology improves. Later, when political conditions are calmer. Later, when the climate agenda stabilizes. Later, when someone else is responsible. Later functioned as a solution without action, a promise that required no fulfillment. Public narratives about Antarctica crystallized around fragility and innocence. Documentaries emphasized untouched landscapes and delicate ecosystems. The continent was portrayed as humanity's mirror, reflecting the consequences of industrial excess. This framing left little room for stories about ambition, secrecy, or military calculation. Such themes felt discordant, almost disrespectful, within an environmental sanctuary. The carrier did not fit the story people wanted Antarctica to tell. A white aircraft carrier without a name suggested preparation, intention, and abandonment. It spoke of planning rather than accident, of strategy rather than discovery. Integrating it into the dominant narrative would complicate the moral clarity that made Antarctic preservation politically effective. Simpler stories prevailed. Internally, however, planning documents retained traces of unease. Contingency frameworks accounted for unexpected heritage discoveries. Emergency response models included protocols for rapid information containment. The language was abstract, but the implications were concrete. These preparations existed because someone, somewhere, understood that surprises were still possible. The carrier thus occupied a strange dual status. Publicly non-existent, privately anticipated. It justified readiness without explanation. It allowed systems to prepare for exposure while maintaining the comfort of silence. Occasionally, momentum threatened this balance. Proposals surfaced to conduct comprehensive underwater cultural surveys before climate change altered sites irreversibly. These initiatives were applauded in principle, then narrowed in scope. Focus shifted to known wrecks along historic shipping lanes. Deep, remote zones were excluded due to cost, risk, or environmental concern. The narrowing always sounded reasonable. The result was always the same. Over time, the carrier's meaning transformed. It was no longer primarily a question of who built it or why it was sunk. It became an example of how unresolved artifacts shape behavior long after their creators disappear. It demonstrated that silence does not require coordination, only alignment. Multiple institutions, acting independently within their own incentives, arrived at the same conclusion. Leave it alone. This alignment was not malicious. It was efficient. It minimized risk, avoided controversy, and preserved cooperation. It also ensured that certain questions remained permanently deferred. Not answered, not denied, simply displaced. Antarctica's reputation as a timeless place masked this process. Ice preserved more than climate history. It preserved decisions. Policies formed around past uncertainties hardened into norms. Those norms guided future action without ever referencing their origins. The carrier lay at the center of this quiet inheritance. Steel resting in darkness, stripped of identifiers, emptied of equipment, it exerted influence not through presence, but through omission. It shaped where ships sailed, where data sharpened, where curiosity slowed. In the end, its most enduring feature was not its hull or deck, but its role as an anchor for institutional memory that no one openly claimed. The carrier did not need to be hidden anymore. It had become something more effective than a secret. It had become part of how Antarctica worked. At a certain distance, patterns stop looking deliberate and start looking natural. The carrier benefited from that illusion more than any policy ever could. As Antarctica became increasingly woven into global systems of monitoring and prediction, its hidden layers receded further from attention. Satellites watched ice movement in near real time. Autonomous buoys relayed ocean temperatures automatically. Algorithms processed volumes of data no human could fully review. In this automated world, anything that did not trigger an alert simply blended into background noise. The carrier triggered no alerts. It moved nowhere. It emitted nothing. It altered no measurable climate variable. In a landscape increasingly defined by change, stasis became its camouflage. Systems designed to detect deviation learned, implicitly, to ignore it. This shift altered the nature of secrecy itself. Earlier decades had relied on classification, restricted access, and human discretion. Now concealment emerged organically from system design. What was not queried did not appear. What did not affect models did not matter. The carrier's invisibility was reinforced by relevance filters rather than sensors. The same logic applied to the surrounding region. Research agendas prioritized areas of rapid transformation, ice shelves collapsing, ecosystems shifting. Stable zones were scientifically less urgent. Funding followed urgency. As a result, the waters above the carrier remained comparatively understudied, not because of explicit restriction, but because they offered little novelty within prevailing frameworks. Novelty, in modern science, is currency. The carrier offered only old questions. Its presence challenged historical assumptions rather than predictive models. It belonged to a category increasingly sidelined, unresolved pasts without immediate application. This categorization was not hostile, it was indifferent. Yet indifference can be more durable than opposition. Without critics to confront or whistleblowers to silence, the carrier existed in a vacuum of attention. It required no defense because no one was attacking its concealment. The absence of conflict became its strongest shield. Meanwhile, geopolitical narratives around Antarctica evolved further. The continent was framed as a commons under threat, a space requiring cooperation above all else. This framing discouraged discussions that might reintroduce competition or historical grievance. Revisiting mid-century military activity risked undermining the moral authority of cooperative governance. Silence served harmony. Harmony, however, came at the cost of complexity. Simplified narratives left little room for acknowledging that Antarctica's present was shaped by decisions made under very different moral and strategic conditions. The carrier embodied that complexity. It was a reminder that the continent's isolation had once been an asset not only to science, but to power. In closed policy circles, the concept of managed ignorance occasionally surfaced, not as an accusation, but as a pragmatic approach. Certain uncertainties, it was argued, were safer left unresolved. Resolution carried unpredictable consequences. Ignorance, when shared and stable, provided continuity. The carrier fit this logic perfectly. It was not that no one cared. It was that caring required ownership, and ownership implied responsibility. Who would claim the carrier? Which nation would explain its presence? Which institution would justify decades of silence? The diffusion of responsibility made action unattractive. Leaving the carrier untouched avoided forcing answers no one was prepared to give. As climate discourse intensified, the moral high ground associated with Antarctic stewardship grew more valuable. Nations competed subtly over leadership in environmental protection, using scientific output as soft power. Introducing a story about a secret aircraft carrier risked contaminating that image. The reputational cost outweighed any benefit of clarification. Public trust played an unexpected role here. Because Antarctic science had delivered genuine critical insights into global climate dynamics, it enjoyed broad credibility. This trust extended implicitly to what was not said as much as to what was published. Silence was interpreted as absence rather than omission. The few who continued to connect disparate threads found themselves isolated not by force, but by scale. Their arguments were detailed, cautious, and well-sourced, yet they competed against narratives supported by massive institutional momentum. Without a triggering event, their work remained peripheral. The carrier's physical degradation continued at its glacial pace. Minor collapses occurred within interior spaces already emptied decades earlier. External lines softened. Marine life adapted around the structure, incorporating it into local ecology. In a literal sense, the ship became part of Antarctica's environment, its artificial origin blurred by time. This ecological integration provided another layer of justification for inaction. Intervening now would disrupt established habitats. Salvage could cause harm. Preservation through neglect appeared ethically preferable. The carrier transitioned from potential artifact to unintended reef, protected not by law but by circumstance. In this state, it exerted influence primarily through anticipation. Planning documents assumed its continued existence. Emergency scenarios included contingencies for its exposure. These preparations acknowledged the carrier indirectly, treating it as a known unknown. The paradox was complete, an object officially non-existent yet operationally considered. The concept of legacy took on new meaning here. The carrier was not a legacy anyone claimed, but it was inherited nonetheless. Each generation of decision-makers accepted constraints shaped by it without understanding their origin. Over time, origin ceased to matter. Only effect remained. Antarctica, often imagined as a place outside time, revealed itself as deeply shaped by temporal layering. Past decisions froze into protocols. Protocols hardened into norms. Norms guided future action invisibly. The carrier lay at the center of one such layering, a material anchor for a history that preferred to remain abstract. In this way, the carrier achieved a strange permanence, not permanence of recognition, but permanence of influence. It shaped behavior without appearing in discourse. It constrained inquiry without issuing prohibitions. It existed most powerfully where it was not mentioned. The longer this condition persisted, the harder it became to imagine disruption. Any attempt to surface the carrier would feel not like discovery, but like disturbance. It would violate an unspoken agreement that had stabilized over decades. Silence had become consensus. And so the carrier remained where it had always been, resting beneath cold water and colder assumptions. It no longer needed protection. It was protected by the way the world had learned to look past it, a testament to how history can be preserved not by remembering, but by collectively deciding not to ask. Eventually, every long-maintained absence begins to shape expectations more strongly than any documented presence ever could. By the time the carrier had been submerged for generations, it no longer needed secrecy to survive. It had trained its surroundings. Institutions, narratives, and behaviors adjusted themselves around it so thoroughly that its continued invisibility felt natural, even necessary. What once required justification now required disruption to question. The most striking change was not external, but cognitive. Antarctica was increasingly understood as a system governed by models: ice mass balance, ocean circulation, atmospheric coupling. These were the dominant lenses through which the continent was perceived. Anything that did not register within those frameworks struggled to exist meaningfully. The carrier did not alter albedo. It did not accelerate melt. It did not influence carbon exchange. Within a model-driven worldview, it was irrelevant. This irrelevance was powerful. It allowed the carrier to pass beneath scrutiny, not because it was unknown, but because it was unneeded. Modern inquiry favors utility. Data is valuable when it predicts or mitigates. History that cannot be operationalized becomes decorative at best, inconvenient at worst. The carrier offered no solutions, only questions, and questions without immediate application are easily postponed. At the policy level, this translated into a preference for continuity. Antarctic governance relied on stability, predictability, and trust among signatories. Reopening unresolved historical issues risked introducing friction into a system that functioned precisely because it avoided such complications. Silence was not framed as avoidance, but as maturity. The past had been managed, and moving forward was the priority. This posture affected how anomalies were handled across the board. When unexpected readings appeared, the instinct was to contextualize them within existing frameworks rather than treat them as invitations to re-examine assumptions. Anomalies were smoothed statistically, explained environmentally, or deprioritized as outliers. This was sound scientific practice in most cases. In the carrier's case, it functioned as camouflage. The human dimension reinforced this effect. Careers were built on incremental contribution, not disruptive synthesis. Young researchers learned quickly which questions advanced funding prospects and which did not. Antarctica rewarded collaboration and focus. It did not reward reopening ambiguous chapters from 70 years ago. The carrier, lacking a clear disciplinary home, fell between silos. Meanwhile, public engagement with Antarctica continued to intensify emotionally. Images of calving glaciers and stranded wildlife evoked urgency and empathy. These narratives demanded attention and action. They also crowded out other interpretations of the continent. There was little appetite for stories involving secrecy, military planning, or unresolved legacy projects. Such stories complicated the moral clarity that environmental advocacy relied upon. The carrier's story did precisely that. It suggested that Antarctica's history included not only noble endurance and scientific cooperation, but calculated use of isolation for strategic ends. Integrating that perspective would require acknowledging that the continent had never been purely neutral, even if treaties later declared it so. That acknowledgement risked eroding the symbolic foundation upon which modern Antarctic governance rested. Within internal planning circles, however, complexity was unavoidable. Risk assessments continued to reference legacy structures without elaboration. Emergency response simulations included scenarios involving unexpected exposure of submerged artifacts. These exercises were framed abstractly, but their persistence indicated unresolved awareness. Preparation existed where explanation did not. Over time, even these preparations became routine. Templates were reused, language standardized. What began as caution hardened into protocol. Protocol, once established, rarely invites inquiry into its origins. It invites compliance. The carrier thus transitioned fully into the realm of institutional background. It influenced outcomes without entering deliberation. Its presence shaped constraints without being named as their cause. This was the final stage of concealment: normalization. Ironically, this normalization made the carrier more durable than active suppression ever could have. Suppression invites resistance. Normalization dissolves it. There was nothing to expose, nothing to challenge. Only an absence that felt intentional but unremarkable. This condition extended to international cooperation. Joint expeditions navigated Antarctic waters with shared assumptions about where not to linger and what not to prioritize. No one needed to articulate these assumptions. They were embedded in planning software, logistical advice, and environmental guidelines. Consensus emerged not through agreement, but through repetition. As older archives continued to open elsewhere, the contrast became more pronounced. Wars were re-examined, intelligence operations declassified, mistakes acknowledged. Antarctica stood apart, frozen not only physically but historiographically. Its modern narrative began in earnest after the treaties, as if what came before had been preparatory rather than constitutive. The carrier contradicted that clean division. It sat at the seam between eras, neither fully wartime nor fully post-war, neither claimed nor disavowed. Its ambiguity was precisely what made it difficult to integrate. History prefers edges. The carrier existed in overlap. Environmental change introduced subtle pressure on this equilibrium. Shifts in ice and currents altered long, stable assumptions. Internal models acknowledged the possibility, however remote, that submerged objects could become exposed or destabilized. These acknowledgments did not lead to action, but they reinforced the need for vigilance. Watchfulness replaced resolution. The paradox deepened. The more distant the carrier became in memory, the more carefully its surroundings were managed. Absence bred caution. Caution sustained absence. In philosophical terms, the carrier became an example of negative space-shaping form. Like an unseen pillar supporting a structure, it defined boundaries without appearing in the design. It demonstrated that what is excluded from narrative can be as influential as what is included. Antarctica, often portrayed as empty, revealed itself as densely structured by invisible decisions. The carrier was one such decision, materialized in steel and then buried under water, sediment, and agreement. Its silence was not accidental. It was maintained not by force, but by convergence. At this stage, the question was no longer whether the carrier would ever be acknowledged, but whether acknowledgement would still mean anything if it occurred. Decades of normalization had dulled its capacity to shock. Exposure might provoke brief curiosity, then be absorbed into the same frameworks that had long rendered it irrelevant. And so the carrier remained, not hidden, not guarded, simply left where history had placed it. Beneath Antarctic waters, it rested within a system that had learned how to forget without erasing, how to manage uncertainty by making it habitual. In that sense, the carrier achieved a kind of quiet triumph. It endured not as a secret waiting to be revealed, but as a fact the world had learned to live around. In the end, what endured was not the mystery itself, but the system built to accommodate it. The carrier had long ceased to be an active concern, yet its gravitational pull remained detectable in subtle ways. Decisions continued to align around an absence no one named. Antarctica functioned smoothly, efficiently, and cooperatively, precisely because certain questions had been trained out of the process. The carrier was one such question, preserved not as an object of inquiry, but as a boundary condition. The passage of time altered the moral landscape in which that boundary existed. What once might have been framed as concealment now appeared as restraint. The world had changed. Conflicts that defined the mid-20th century no longer structured global politics in the same way. Ideologies had collapsed, alliances reshaped, priorities shifted. In this new context, revisiting unresolved Antarctic legacies seemed less like truth-seeking and more like disturbance. Stability carried its own ethical weight. This reframing softened the carrier's implications. It was no longer a reminder of unfinished wartime ambitions, but an artifact of a different era's logic. That logic, however flawed, belonged to a world that no longer existed. Bringing it forward offered little guidance for present challenges. Climate change, resource scarcity, and geopolitical fragmentation demanded attention now. The past, especially a past so resistant to clean resolution, felt increasingly optional. Institutional language adapted accordingly. Terms like historical sensitivity and legacy complexity entered internal vocabularies, signaling awareness without commitment. These phrases acknowledged depth while discouraging excavation. They framed non-action as wisdom rather than avoidance. The carrier benefited from this rhetorical evolution, its silence dignified by time. Within scientific culture, a parallel evolution occurred. The value of uncertainty shifted. Where earlier generations sought to reduce unknowns aggressively, contemporary science accepted uncertainty as inherent and sometimes irreducible. Models incorporated margins of error. Projections acknowledged limits. Not every anomaly demanded closure. Some were bracketed indefinitely. The carrier fit neatly into this category. Educational narratives reflected this shift. Students learned to work with incomplete data, to accept provisional understanding. Antarctica was taught as a system still revealing itself, not as a place haunted by hidden decisions. This orientation fostered humility, but it also narrowed curiosity. Questions without clear methodological pathways were set aside. The carrier's lack of methodological tractability reinforced its marginalization. Investigating it required crossing disciplinary, political, and ethical boundaries simultaneously. No single field could claim ownership. No funding body could justify the risk. Complexity became deterrence. Even so, the carrier continued to shape contingency thinking. Internal scenario planning acknowledged that unexpected exposure, whether through environmental change or technological advancement, could occur. Responses were outlined, refined, and archived. These preparations were quiet, procedural, and deliberately abstract. They assumed discovery without imagining disclosure. This assumption revealed an underlying truth. The system did not fear the carrier itself. It feared narrative rupture. Discovery could be managed. Explanation was the threat. Explanation would require assigning intention, responsibility, and consequence across decades and borders. Silence avoided that reckoning. The world outside Antarctica mirrored this dynamic in other domains. Many societies learned to coexist with unresolved histories, to prioritize forward momentum over retrospective clarity. Truth commissions, declassifications, and acknowledgments occurred selectively, often where political incentives aligned. Where they did not, ambiguity persisted. The carrier was not unique in this regard. It was simply isolated enough to endure without challenge. Antarctica's isolation amplified this endurance. Distance discouraged activism. Cold deterred intrusion. Bureaucracy filtered access. Together, these factors created a buffer zone not just for ice, but for memory. The carrier lay within that buffer, insulated from the currents of public discourse. As time advanced, the carrier's story approached a tipping point of irrelevance. Not because it lacked significance, but because significance itself is time-bound. What matters is shaped by context, urgency, and imagination. The carrier belonged to a context that had faded, an urgency that had expired, an imagination that had moved on. Yet traces remained, in routing decisions, in data resolutions, in the quiet confidence with which certain questions were never raised. These traces were not obvious. They required attentiveness to absence rather than presence. To notice them was to notice how systems remember without speaking. The carrier thus served as a case study in institutional forgetting. Not erasure, but containment. Not denial, but deferral. It showed how history could be acknowledged internally while remaining invisible externally, how knowledge could exist without circulation. In philosophical terms, it challenged the assumption that revelation is the natural endpoint of inquiry. Some truths do not surface because systems evolve to function around them. Exposure becomes unnecessary. Silence becomes infrastructure. This infrastructure did not demand loyalty or secrecy oaths. It demanded only participation. By operating within established frameworks, individuals reinforced the status quo without intention. The carrier persisted because no one needed to protect it actively. It was protected by alignment. At this stage, the carrier no longer represented a secret waiting to be uncovered. It represented a decision continually renewed through inaction. Each year that passed without engagement reaffirmed the choice to leave it where it was, materially and narratively. Antarctica, often imagined as untouched, revealed itself as deeply shaped by such choices. Its apparent purity was maintained not by absence of history, but by selective inheritance. The carrier was one inheritance among many, distinct only in its physicality. Beneath the ice and water, the ship remained unchanged in purpose, but transformed in meaning. It was no longer about what had happened, but about what was allowed to matter. And in that sense, the carrier had already delivered its final lesson: that the most enduring forces are not those that act openly, but those that quietly define the limits of attention. Nothing dramatic marked the moment when the carrier ceased to matter. There was no announcement, no closing of files, no final decision entered into record. It faded the way long shadows do, not by vanishing, but by losing contrast against the ground beneath them. What remained was a shape that no longer startled, no longer demanded explanation, yet still influenced how everything around it was arranged. Antarctica continued its slow transformation. Ice shelves calved, reformed, and retreated again. New research stations appeared with modular efficiency, their presence justified by climate models and international cooperation. Data flowed outward in streams so constant they felt permanent. In this steady movement, the past lost urgency. History became background context rather than active force. The carrier, once a disruption, became part of that background. What survived was not ignorance, but a particular kind of knowledge, implicit, unspoken, and distributed. No single archive contained the full story. No individual could recount it end to end. Instead, fragments lived in procedures, assumptions, and exclusions. Routes were chosen, permissions delayed, resolutions softened. Each action made sense on its own. Together they traced the outline of something never named. This form of knowledge proved remarkably resilient. It did not depend on secrecy laws or enforcement mechanisms. It depended on alignment. Scientists aligned with funding incentives. Governments aligned with diplomatic stability. Institutions aligned with narratives that preserved cooperation. The carrier existed at the intersection of these alignments, held in place by mutual convenience rather than mutual agreement. From a distance, this might resemble conspiracy. From within, it felt like administration. No one woke each morning intent on hiding a ship. They woke intent on completing tasks, meeting objectives, avoiding unnecessary complications. The carrier represented complication. Leaving it alone was efficient. Efficiency became the unspoken ethic governing its fate. Time, resources, attention, these were finite. The carrier promised no return on investment. Excavating it would consume all three while producing uncertainty. Efficiency favored silence. The irony was that this silence required constant renewal. Each generation reaffirmed it not through choice, but through inheritance. New researchers accepted existing frameworks. New officials followed established protocols. New narratives drew from familiar imagery. The carrier was absent from all of these, and thus remained absent from thought. In this way, the carrier outlasted its creators. The ambitions that placed it there dissolved with the regimes that conceived them. The strategies that justified its concealment faded with the conflicts that necessitated them. What remained was structure. Structure is what persists when intention is gone. Antarctica's structure proved uniquely capable of preserving such residues. Its remoteness discouraged scrutiny. Its treaties discouraged confrontation. Its environment discouraged intrusion. These factors combined to create a landscape where unresolved artifacts could persist indefinitely without resolution or recognition. The carrier was not alone in this. Other remnants existed elsewhere, less dramatic but equally unexamined. Antarctica was not a blank slate, it was a layered one. The difference was that most layers were abstract: agreements, assumptions, boundaries. The carrier was concrete: steel in water, geometry in sediment. That concreteness gave it potential power, even as it lay dormant. It was a fixed point around which stories could eventually reorganize if conditions ever changed. For now, those conditions did not exist. Curiosity remained fragmented. Urgency remained elsewhere. Silence remained convenient. The lesson embedded in this outcome was subtle, but profound. History does not always resolve into clarity. Some events become absorbed into systems that move on without them. The carrier demonstrated that omission can be an outcome, not a failure. That forgetting can be active, sustained, and rational. This does not mean truth vanished. It means truth ceased to circulate. It became localized, inert, like the ship itself. Accessible in theory, unreachable in practice. Present, but functionally absent. Antarctica's image as a place beyond politics remained intact because it was carefully curated. That curation did not require falsehoods. It required emphasis. Emphasize ice over intention. Emphasize future over past. Emphasize fragility over complexity. Within that emphasis, the carrier had no place. And yet its influence lingered. It shaped caution. It shaped planning. It shaped the quiet confidence with which certain areas were left unexplored. It shaped the understanding that not everything needed to be known to function. In the end, the carrier's story did not conclude with revelation or recovery. It concluded with normalization. The most effective form of concealment was not to hide something, but to make its absence feel ordinary. Beneath Antarctic waters, the ship remained unchanged in its final state, emptied, painted, and deliberately sunk. Above it, generations came and went, building systems that unknowingly honored its presence by accommodating it. The world did not forget the carrier. It learned how to live without asking about it. That was the final inheritance of this long chain of expeditions, agreements, and silences. Not a secret kept, but a question set aside so thoroughly that it no longer interrupted progress. Antarctica moved forward, carrying its unresolved weight beneath the ice, proof that history does not always demand answers. Sometimes, it only demands that nothing disturb what has already been decided.